set your receivers, set your receivers, set your receivers, set your receivers, set your receivers.
You are tuned to the Radio Phonics Laboratory Radio Hour, and this week we are coming to you live with the studio audience from the spacious hall where the Queen City Emergency Net hosts their monthly meeting. Thanks for having me as your guest tonight and for tuning in this evening. I'm Justin Patrick Moore, Kilo Echo 8, Charlie Oscar Yankee, and I shall be your host on this guided tour over the airwaves of our radio frequencies, down the old copper wires of the telegraph and telephone lines, and into the laboratories where strange scientists of sound dissected speech and broke it down into funky phonics. It's a story of inventors and engineers who moonlighted as musicians to bring us the earliest form of electronic music. In 1958, an inspired woman named Daphne Aram helped to found one of the first electronic music studios, the Radiophonic Workshop at the British Broadcasting Corporation. She had been inspired to explore electronics when she heard about experiments with musique concrète, that is, people who manipulated phonograph records and tapes to make new worlds of sound. But she had also been inspired by a prophetic book written by Francis Bacon in 1626 called A New Atlantis, and had tacked a passage from it onto the wall of the new music studio as a kind of mission statement for the work they would pursue. Hands down, the most famous musical creation from the Radiophonic Workshop is the theme song to Doctor Who. Delia Derbyshire was the electronic musician who realized the score for this innovative song, recording sounds made from audio oscillators like this one, and editing those tapes and layering those tapes to create the iconic song. I first saw Doctor Who when I was 10 years old, and I was mesmerized by the stories and the sounds. Doctor Who gave me my first taste of electronic music, and I fell in love for life. I became so obsessed with Doctor Who as a young kid that if my family was invited over somewhere for dinner on a Saturday night, I would try to connive a way for us to get home early enough by 10 p.m. so I could tune into the show. Doctor Who aired on Channel 48 WCET, a PBS station, and when they had their periodic pledge drive, they would put the telephone number out onto the TV and have people call in to pledge their support to the show. I was so obsessed, I would get irritated when the announcers came on and interrupted the show and stopped to ask for money. I called the pledge drive number just to see what would happen, even though as a 10-year-old I had no money. The phone rang, and a few seconds later I could hear it over the TV. This gave me a thrill like no other, hearing something I did cause a sound to be heard on the television set. So I called it again and again on multiple pledge drives. I did start feeling guilty about doing this, especially when the announcer on the TV would say, "And we have another call, a pledge of support for Doctor Who." But I kept on doing it on every pledge drive until I got old enough to fear getting caught in my early teens. Later, I became enamored with the community radio station WAIF 88.3 FM. In the 6th grade, I started to call in on one of their summer talk shows so I could hear my voice come back over the air. They didn't have a way of screening their calls, so they didn't know it was going to be just some bored kid. Hearing my voice come back over the radio, usually with feedback because I had failed to turn down my own radio, never stopped being excited. Eventually, I got onto radio somewhat legitimately, but still quite illegal during my brief tenure as a student at Antioch College on their pirate FM station, Anti-Watt. Anti-Watt covered the village of Yellow Springs, and I had my own show on there called The Psychedelicatessen with a few friends. Then, after I dropped out of college, I came back home, got a job at the library, and began my life as a bohemian, going to electronic noise music shows, poetry readings, and art openings. I got involved at WAIF and became a programmer for their long-standing experimental music show, Art Damage, and later the more eclectic On the Way to the Peak of Normal. And I was on the air with them from between 2001 to 2014. When I left WAIF, I thought I would use my new free time to devote to writing, but I found I actually couldn't quit radio. I'd always been interested in shortwave radio and ham radio, which I'd been exposed to from my great-grandpas and the Boy Scouts. I had met a member of the Okayan Amateur Radio Society on the bus, and he told me about the ham classes being offered by the club, and I decided to go ahead and get my ticket as part of a general obsession with radio and alternative forms of communication. Another long-standing interest of mine is the history of the telephone system and the phone freaks who figured out ways to explore Ma Bell and her network of wires by whistling tones into the telephone to make free calls. My book, The Radiophonics Laboratory, became a way to explore all these different interests as it goes deep into the interconnected history between telecommunications, speech synthesis, and the birth of electronic music. And the seeds for this book began as articles I wrote for the Okayan's newsletter, the Q5. In this talk, I can only give a brief taste of some of what's in here, but we'll start at the beginning and go back to Francis Bacon's book from 1626, A New Atlantis, and the passage Daphne Aram had tacked onto the wall of the BBC's radiophonic workshop. The section she posted painted a picture of scientific sound researchers exploring the nature of acoustics through the use of a new class of instruments, inventing never-before-heard sounds while also conveying them across great distances. Bacon wrote, we have also sound houses, and we practice and demonstrate all sounds in their generation. We have harmonies which you have not, of quarter sounds and lesser slides of sounds. Diverse instruments of music likewise to you unknown. We also have means to convey sounds in trunks and pipes, in strange lines and across distances. Now we know these sound houses as electronic music studios. Now we know these instruments as synthesizers and electronic sound generators. Now we have the means to convey sounds in trunks and pipes along lines and strange distances via our global communications network that started with telegraphy, the telephone, radio, and expanded into television, satellite, and the internet. But it all got started with the telegraph and telephone companies who transformed the dits and dahs of Morse code into the blips and bleeps of electronic music. Our story continues in Ohio. Just like human flight, electronic music can be said to have originated from the children of Ohio. Elisha Gray, who ties with Alexander Graham Bell as the inventor of the telephone, was a child of Ohio, born in Barnesville in 1835, the same year that Samuel Morse invented his system of dots and dashes. Gray became enraptured with electricity as a young man while attending Oberlin College. In 1867, at the age of 30 years after Morse got his telegraph patent, Gray received his patent for the design of an improved telegraph. Eventually, Gray would become obsessed with solving the problem of creating a multiple telegraph, a way to transmit multiple simultaneous messages over the same wire. To do this, he needed to figure out a way to control the sound that was coming from an electromagnetic circuit. This led him to invent a basic oscillator made of steel rods whose vibrations were transmitted over a telegraph line. The instrument consisted of a number of single-tone oscillators that could play over a range of 2 octaves. Each tone was controlled by a telegraph key. This became the electroharmonic telegraph, one of the earliest electronic music instruments. A player equipped with one of these keyboards could now dash out simple melodies over the wires, moving music along strange lines and distances. This use of the oscillator prefigured their later extensive use in music making, and in doing so, Gray had not only made the first electronic music instrument, but had achieved multi-tone transmission, prefiguring the use of multi-tone dialing that later became standard with the telephone. In 1896, another graduate of Oberlin College coined the word synthesizer and invented the very first one. His name was Thaddeus Cahill, and his creation was a gargantuan device that took up entire city blocks, but could only be heard over the telephone line. He called it the telharmonium. It was patented in 1897, but it took until 1906 before the public was able to hear it. The telharmonium used an early form of additive synthesis, that is, mixing multiple audio waveforms together to create its distinctive sounds. All the extensive mechanical and electrical gear required to make it work weighed an impressive 200 tons. Even the most gargantuan of today's keyboards are nothing compared to this boat anchor. It took up an entire plant on what Cahill called an entire floor on what he called the music plant at 39th Street and Broadway. The music plant was going to be like any other utility, a service you could pipe in over your newly installed telephone lines courtesy of AT&T. The instrument looked like a power generator, put out 670 kilowatts, and required massive energy inputs. In other words, as a musical instrument, it was totally unsustainable. But for noise music fanatics like myself, the sound of the electrical hum and machinery in the music plant alone must have been enough to send us into a state of rapturous ecstasy. I imagine it might have sounded something like this. Cahill had ambitious plans for his instrument. He advocated that a form of electric sleep music could be tapped at any time for the cure of modern nervous disorders. The electric drones could also be used to relieve boredom in the workplace. And this is how many people use ambient electronica today. Long drones, extended tones, electric sleep music. People stream music over their phones all the time without a thought in the world, while Cahill's work has mostly been forgotten and the instrument itself has long ago been recycled for scrap metal. No known recordings of the telharmonium have survived. Another music engineer was the Russian inventor Leon Theremin, who imagined the music made by interacting with antennas. Theremin was brilliant. At 5, he played the piano, and at 9, he took up the cello. In school, he studied topics like high-frequency currents, magnetic fields, optics, astronomy, and atomic theory. You know, all the usual stuff you take when you're in school. His studies were overshadowed when World War I broke out, and in 1916 he was drafted and assigned to the radio technical department. There he worked on transmitters and oversaw the construction of a powerful and strategic radio station. But at the time, Theremin wasn't really all that interested in radio. He was more interested in psychology, the practice of hypnosis, and the study of atomic structures with X-rays. But nonetheless, one of his mentors pushed him to work with the new vacuum tube technology that was just becoming available. His first project involved the exploration of the human body's natural electrical capacitance to set up a simple burglar alarm that he called the radio watchman. This device was made by using a vacuum tube as a transmitter at a specific high frequency directed to an antenna. The antenna only radiated a small field of about 16 feet. The circuits were calibrated so that when a person walked into the radiation pattern, it would change the capacitance, causing a switch to close and set off an audible signal. Next, Theremin was tasked with creating a high-frequency oscillator to measure the dielectric constant of gases in a variety of conditions. And to do this, he made a circuit and placed it between a glass between two plates of a capacitor. Changes in the temperature were measured by a needle on a meter, and this device was so sensitive it ended up being able to be set off by the slightest movement of the hand. He refined it by adding a vacuum tube oscillator and a tuned circuit. The harmonics generated by the oscillator were filtered out to leave a single frequency that he can listen to on his headphones. As Theremin played with this tool, he noticed again how the presence of his hand movements near the circuitry were registered as variations in the density of the gas and now measured by a change in the pitch. Closer to the capacitor, the pitch became higher. While further away, the pitch became lower. And shaking his hand created vibrato. His musical self, long dormant under the influences of war and communism, came alive, and he started to use this instrument to tease out the fragments he loved from his classical repertoire. Word quickly traveled after that around the Institute that Theremin was playing music on a voltmeter. His mentor encouraged him to refine what he had discovered, the capacitance of the body interacting with the circuit to change its frequency into an instrument. The result is the etherphone, but more popularly known as the theremin, an instrument of circuits and antennas. Back in the United States, over at Bell Telephone Laboratories in Murray Hill, New Jersey, the prophetic fiction of Francis Bacon started to become more fully alive with the work of Homer Dudley, the inventor of the vocoder. Dudley was an electronic and acoustic engineer at Bell whose work revolved around the idea that human speech is fundamentally a form of radio communication. That's why this is a radio hour for a radio club. Dudley had this revelation in 1928 when he was otherwise out of commission in a Manhattan hospital bed. Discoveries are often made from playfully messing around with things, either in horseplay or boredom. And Dudley kept himself entertained just as a kid might by making weird sounds with his voice by changing the shape of his mouth. Just by making weird, goofy sounds, Dudley had the insight that his vocal cords were acting as a transmitter of a periodic waveform, a kind of wave that repeats at a constant, with his nose and throat acting as the resonating filters, and his mouth and tongue producing the harmonic content, or formants, these being the distinctive pitch of vowel sounds. He also observed that the frequencies of his voice vibrated at a faster rate than the mouth itself moved. Once recovered, he wrote a paper on the topic called The Carrier Nature of Speech for the Bell Labs Technical Journal, writing that speech is like a radio wave in that information is transmitted over a suitably chosen carrier. A carrier being a waveform encoded with information, in this case spoken language encoded in the waveform of sounds made by our tongue and vocal tracts. Dudley thought his discovery might have an application in the area of sound compression, and he made it his ambition to free up some of the phone company's precious bandwidth by packing in more conversations onto the copper lines. To do this, he invented the vocoder, short for the voice coder. His machine was first demonstrated at Harvard in 1936, and it works by measuring the spectral characteristics of speech, pitch, amplitude, noise, and other aspects of sound, and how they change over time. In a vocoder, the signal going into the microphone gets divided by filters into a number of different frequency bands, which allow the vocoder to reduce the information needed to store speech to a series of numbers representing each band. Then, on the output end, at the speaker or headphone, the vocoder reverses the process to synthesize speech electronically. Information about the instantaneous frequency or the frequency of a signal at a specific point in time from the original spoken words gets discarded by the filters. What comes out on the other end then ends up sounding distinctly robotic, dehumanized, and musical like this.
because of the criminal activities and money laundering frauds done by you. The investigation team of our department and the FBI are investigating more about this case file. We are trying to reach you for the last time to verify about such activities. Just in case we will not hear back from you, it will be considered as an intentional fraud. And the lawsuit will be filed under your name. In order to get more information and talk to the Social Security officer, kindly press 1. I repeat, press 1 to connect your call to Social Security officer. Thank you.
Homer Dudley wasn't interested in using the vocoder to commit telephone fraud, but he did have great success in his aim of reducing the phone line bandwidth. But it never got used for that purpose on the original telephone line. After the war, vocoding continued at Bell Labs, but was now being put to other purposes and was being done on the huge mainframe computers they had recently acquired from IBM. This is where Max Matthews, the patron saint of computer music, comes into our story. But first, we need to talk about Audrey. I would be a very bad husband if I didn't talk about Audrey, especially on the day of our anniversary. 15 years married and 21 together today, October 10th. Audrey, thank you. Audrey is my lovely wife, but also the name of the first project that has achieved speech recognition, the flip side to speech synthesis. Without the ability for machines to both recognize speech and synthesize it, the wonder twins of today's consumer electronics, Siri and Alexa, would not be possible. With speech synthesis and recognition in place, humans can now speak and sometimes yell and cuss at the wide range of interconnected devices that will perk up and speak back to us. In 1952, over half a century before Alexa could respond to a voice question of where to find the best Thai carryout, Audrey was on the scene. She derived her name from her special power, automatic digit recognition. She was a collection of circuits capable of perceiving numbers spoken into an ordinary telephone. Due to the technological limits of the time, she could only recognize the spoken numbers of 0 through 9. When the digits ruddered into a mic on the handset, Audrey would respond by illuminating a corresponding bulb on the front panel of the device. It sounds simple today, but this marvel was only achieved after overcoming steep technical hurdles. Despite all the limitations around her use, the researchers proved that creating a machine capable of recognizing human speech wasn't a pipe dream, and other researchers soon followed down the path Audrey opened up, leading to the dynamic voice recognition systems we have today. In 1957, 5 years after Audrey was first switched on, computer music was born at Bell Labs. Max Matthews was a physicist who had cut his teeth working on early analog computers with Vannevar Bush. One of the projects Matthews was tasked with at Bell was to see if he could record his voice and transform it into a digital signal that could be read by a computer, and then transform it back again into an analog signal that could be played on a speaker. He was mentored in this process by a guy named John R. Pierce. Pierce had done essential work with Claude Shannon, the father of information theory. And Pierce and Shannon had both worked together on the Sig Sally transmissions. Matthews and John Pierce were both musicians on the side. Matthews played the violin and Pierce played the piano. One night, the two of them were at a classical music concert together, and Pierce asked, "Max, if you can get a sound out of a computer, could you write a music program to synthesize music on a computer?" Matthews was up for the challenge, and Pierce encouraged him to take time off his speech coding research to focus on writing a music program. The result was Music 1. It was a beginning. It gave a programmer control over the pitch, scale, and notes of a sound, but only one voice. Newman Gutman, a linguist and psychoacoustics researcher at Bell, wrote the first piece of music with the software, and it's called the Silver Scale. It only lasts 17 seconds and sounds like some random notes from a lo-fi video game. I can't play the original due to copyright at this moment, but sounds like these are in the general ballpark. Refinement and expansion of this came later as new versions of the music software were developed and followed. Then in 1961, another group of Bell Labs employees worked together to develop a vocoding program using the IBM 704. They demonstrated it by having it sing Daisy Bell, or A Bicycle Built for Two. Lovely as the a cappella computer was, it was deemed in need of instrumental accompaniment. For this part of the song, they sought out Matthew's help to program the 8-bit melody portion of Daisy Bell using an IBM 7090. One day, science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke was visiting John Pierce at Bell Labs and got to see a demonstration of speech synthesis and heard the computer sing Daisy Bell. He was so fascinated by witnessing this computational marvel that he wrote the song into a screenplay for 2001, A Space Odyssey, where the computer Hal sings it during his climactic mental breakdown.
Yeah, that's something.
Daisy Bell and many other pieces of music made at Bell Labs ended up on this record that came out in 1962, Music from Mathematics, played by IBM 7090 and digital to sound transducer. Would you pass that around?
That's gotta be hard to find.
All of this work, thank God for eBay, all of this work led Bell Labs to becoming one of the first electronic music laboratories. It was a bona fide sound house in the way Francis Bacon had used the term all the way back in 1626. Matthews would go on to write several other versions of the music program, up to number 5, each adding versatility to what could be done. He shared the code and other programmers created their own versions of music. Now it remains widespread in electronic music. It is still alive as the extremely flexible program named Max, after its original creator. Vocoders, in turn, have found their way into our cell phones. Whenever we make a phone call, our voice gets coded, which is why the early cell phones sounded so glitchy. Vocoders are also used in our ham DMR radios and in trunking systems with codecs that gives them their strange, glitchy sound. Beyond Bell Labs, many other sound houses came into being around the mid-century, and they all took shape with some involvement of radio stations or radio companies. One of them was the Studio for Electronic Music of the West German Radio at the Westdeutsche Rundfunk, established in 1951. A musical theorist there by the name of Werner Mayer Epler had been inspired by the possibilities inherent in the vocoder and began advocating for a new form of electrical music. There, they used newly invented instruments and electronic test equipment, such as audio oscillators, to create new worlds of sound. Epler went on to become a mentor of Karlheinz Stockhausen, who would go on to influence generations of music makers. Stockhausen achieved additive synthesis in 1953 and 1954 by combining layer after layer after layer of sounds from sine wave generators onto audio tape at a time when synthesizers as such were not available. In 1963, composer John Chowning had been inspired to try his hand at computer music when he read a paper by Matthews in Science titled "The Digital Computer as Musical Instrument." He made arrangements to meet Matthews at Bell Labs and was given a copy of the Music 4 program, which he took with him back to Stanford. The early hackers there at the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory taught Chowning how to program with the music software. Then, during the course of his work with computer music, he discovered the principles behind FM audio synthesis in 1967. FM synthesis uses frequency modulation on audio waves in a similar way to the way frequency modulation is used on radio waves. Chowning became a passionate advocate for computer music and established the Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics at Stanford. His work with FM synthesis gave birth to more affordable synthesizers in the 80s, and he licensed his discoveries to Yamaha, and they brought out the DX7 keyboard, which is heard on all manner of underground synth pop music from the era to totally mainstream stuff like the music of Kenny Loggins. It sounds like this. Now that our frequencies have been properly modulated, I'd like to say thank you for tuning in to the Radiophonics Laboratory Radio Hour. The phone lines will remain open if anyone has any questions.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Bob.
Keith Emerson of Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
Yes.
In the movie Nighthawks, he did all of the music, all himself on synthesizers for the whole movie.
Okay.
On there too. How much was he involved in influencing a lot of that? Emerson, Lake and Palmer obviously did too, but.
I have no idea specifically what, Moog came out with his synthesizers in the 60s, and from there kind of started getting into mainstream music, but before that, more kind of academic composers would go to places like Bell Labs because they had the computers and the research. It was only after Moog came out with his that it kind of started filtering out into popular music and away from kind of these like academic kind of composers.
If you listen to that soundtrack on there too, all the way through, what he did was phenomenal through the whole thing. Just very, very dramatic on the whole way. It is. The whole thing is like that.
Next.
That's it.
Oh, go ahead, Henry.
Yeah, I've got one for you. Back when I was in grade school, I went to school with a girl whose last name was Vale. And she brought a family letter. Gail was the assistant to Samuel Morse.
Okay.
And one night, after dinner, he went and invented the Vale code, which he gave to Samuel Morse and goes, I think you'll find this useful for the alphabet. And it became the Morse code.
Oh, that's fascinating. I've never heard that.
I didn't hear it either, like I said, somebody read a family letter in grade school.
That's a cool show and tell.
Yeah. I mean, it beats my family.
It's just.
Yeah.
That's
I learned
nice.
so much. I don't even know how to ask questions.
Yeah.
I know somebody who they need to give that book to, for sure.
There's a lot more I couldn't get into in the book.
Yeah, I definitely need to get 2 copies.
Where's the book available?
I have some for sale tonight, and on Amazon, bookshop.org, or Shake It Records.
And how much does it cost to get it autographed?
It's $18
For the autograph?
for all of it.
Oh, okay.
Do you have Venmo?
You can pay on your phone. Yeah, it's straight to the publisher's website. So I got a QR
You got a
code.
QR code?
Okay, cool.
I have to run a meeting, but
Sure.
I would like 2 copies.
Well, I'll be here afterwards, and if anybody wants to try out the theremin.
Can you hang out?